Hey students, let's talk a little bit about plot. I know that we've kind of already been talking about a lot of these things. Not only have you read about them, we've talked about them on the discussion board, and you've been trying to work these things out in your exercises. But all this is really going to start to come together as we talk about conflict and plot. Um, so essentially, what we've been talking about are our characters this last week, right? And how it's our job as writers to create these really complex characters who not only have external drivers. um, Typically in a story, characters want something, and we try to make it really difficult for them to get that, and that's part of what we watch unfold. Um, Part of that is also characters having worries as well. So we want them to be, we want them to have stakes in terms of getting what they want or not getting it. And so that's part of those worries that we create for them. The internal drivers are not always apparent when you're reading a story, but as a writer, you really should know what does your character want beyond, maybe the immediate thing. What are they hoping for? What is like the ultimate goal for them? What are their absolute worst fears? And part of understanding your character really well and knowing all four of those categories is really going to help you to create a conflict that will put the most amount of pressure on your character. And that's ultimately what we want for short story. So your first job here is to really create that complex character, right? We want flawed characters, characters who have all of those hopes, want, fears, and worries. We should know all of those too. Even if they don't come out in a story, you really should know your character really, really well. I get the sense, just having read a lot, all of your character exercises, that most of you just were creating a character, and that character wasn't quite clear to you yet. It felt maybe like a kind of a flat character. In fact, later we'll talk about agency. But essentially, what I'm saying here is that you took a character and you drop them into a bad situation, and just because I'm only seeing a fraction of the story, but the character didn't feel fully fleshed out. So one thing that I know I do when I'm trying to work with a new character, even if it's actually a character that's not going to appear for very long in a story, or maybe just a character I need to serve as a function, I kind of quickly jot down everything I can think about in terms of that character. What's their background? Where did they come from? What's their job if they have one? What's their favorite saying, right? What are their annoying habits? So then you can create something that feels close to human nature, right? A really, a character who, again, maybe not serve a larger purpose other than to help unfold plot, or to show something about your main character. But if you have those interesting complexities about that character is going to seem a lot more deep and original. And you never know, you actually might end up with a character that serves an even bigger purpose than you thought. So really try to create those complex characters, especially when it comes to your main characters. I know when I teach this class face to face, I typically have a journal exercise where we detail out, I think it's 32 different questions about a character. And if you can answer all of those things, then you know that character fairly well. So think about creating characters in that sense. Once you have those complex characters, then you can understand what kind of conflicts should you put them in. And again, we don't want to put them in situations in which they can sort of easily figure out. We want to put them in a situation that's going to be kind of difficult for them. If they're a character who's really rigid in terms of, rule following and their morals, you want to put them in a situation where that kind of thing is called into question, because that's what's really interesting about story is conflict. And that's ultimately what we're trying to get to. We're trying to create conflict, which creates plot, and plot really is story. I think I've said that before in another lecture, that conflict is story. And it truly is. If you think about even your favorite movies or your favorite TV shows, the shows themselves and the film, they're not about characters whose lives are just unfolding and they're fantastic. They're oftentimes in really crappy situations, and that's what's really interesting, and that's what makes it good, and that's why we don't want to stop watching whatever we're watching, because we're really invested in how they figure out and how they navigate that world. So here's the thing about agency. All that agency really means is that characters have to be able to make choices and do things on their own. We don't want to create stories in which characters, like bad things happen to good characters. And several of you did that in your character exercise, where you just had like this good person and like their whole world falls apart. And that does happen, but you also want that character to make choices about the world too. We want them to be complex enough that they're going to make some bad decisions, and that's okay. You can have good characters, and you can have good characters who bad stuff happens to, but that's not what creates plot. It's not all the external forces that happen to a character that makes story, it's all the actual internal. So it's your character who's driving the plot, not the other way around. Okay? So that said, a really amazing, great short story does not have to be a life or death situation. You do not have to kill off characters in order to put your character in a crappy situation. I think 6 of you started your character exercises with a death of some sort, which is fine to do, but it just felt like almost like an ending and not necessarily a beginning. I don't know how to better say it. It just felt like you didn't know what else to do, so you just thought you would kill someone off at the beginning of the story. And that, again, that can be a fine way to start. It kind of just depends, but what we really want to watch characters do is have a difficult situation on their hands. So if you're gonna kill someone off at the beginning of the story, that person who died should be really central to your other character. And I mean central, not just in terms of like emotional necessity, but perhaps they were the caretaker of that character. Perhaps they provided a role that no one else could kind of fill. Or perhaps, it's a death that your character is then blamed for. Those are all, different kinds of situations. Again, we want to be careful though of just letting bad things happen to good characters. We want to make sure that our good characters are complex enough that they also make some bad choices and bad decisions, and we're going to watch them struggle with that. So it's really about kind of having that authorial hand, right? As an author, putting your hand over the story and manipulating it so that we get the best out of, we get to watch, not necessarily your character be the best, but we get to watch the best plot unfold because we're highly invested in what's going to happen. So with the inciting incident, again, I know we've talked about this before, but I just want to reiterate because it's super important to getting plot off and running in the right way. We've talked about the dramatic arc, and your book is going to talk a little bit more about that dramatic arc. The author of your textbook calls this the modified pyramid, but essentially with short stories specifically, our conflict has to start right at the beginning of our stories. Fiction is highly compressed. It's not as compressed as poetry, but it is highly compressed, and so you don't have time to unfold what a character's regular day might look like. You really have to start at the point of conflict, which will make the most sense to readers. So some of what I had asked you guys on that character exercise, it was your beginnings exercise, was why is today unlike any other day? So why would you start the story there? On some of your beginning exercises, you just started like, oh, the character, here's their alarm, and then they wake up and they brush their teeth and they eat breakfast, and all these other sort of normal things happen, and then by the end of your beginning, then the unnormal things, that's not the right way to say that, but you know what I mean, like then the weird things start happening to your character. And again, that's kind of not what we want to do as short fiction writers. Maybe if you're a novelist, you might have more time to unfold what a normal day looks like. But again, think of A and P. Think of how from the very first sentence of that particular story, we are told why today is unlike any other day. In fact, we're so familiar, most of us, with grocery stores that we don't even need to any backstory at all. In fact, Sammy never really backs up the story beyond that first that day that we see, because we don't need to know any of that. all that's important for that particular story is right there in that particular moment. The other thing that the beginning of a story has to establish basically right away is, what is the conflict? And if you're thinking to yourself like, oh my gosh, I can't like get the conflict in right away, well, then there should be some kind of clues leading up to those central conflicts. So in A Fable with White Slips of Paper Falling Out of the Pockets, the very first sentence of the whole story says, once there was a man who happened to buy God's overcoat. Now, if you've never read this story before, if you haven't yet prior to watching this lecture, you might not know quite how to place that particular information. And that's okay. But now that we've read that story, we can come back and say like, oh, that is really central. This is part of the conflict. The man having that coat and the prayers that come through the pockets, right? This becomes the crux of the story. So we can trace the whole entire conflict of that story back to that particular first line. If we notice here, this is the first line from This Blessed House. They discovered the first one in a cupboard above the stove beside an unopened bottle of malt vinegar. Sorry, that's a little hard to read down there. But essentially, again, if you didn't know who they are or what they had discovered, that's okay upon your first reading. But as we're going backward and we're trying to pick these stories apart and really figure out structure and how they work, we can see that they are Twinkle and Sanjeev, and for them, the first one being discovered is one of those religious icons, which we know end up coming between Twinkle and Sanjeev. So we know right there, having read the story now, that we can see the central conflict of the story is already taking place in that first sentence. So this is what I want you to aim for. As you're working this week, I want you to attempt this, but also as you're thinking about your workshop submission too, is really try to get your story started from the very first sentence. So again, remember, fiction's highly compressed, so every word is going to have a function to serve in the story. So if that detail is there just to be interesting, it's not good enough, right? Details should reveal character, they should show tone, emotion, they should be connected to plot even. So we want all of those things, again, to serve a larger purpose. Part of this is not only to engage the readers right away, but we are unfolding a story in a way that we can pull them along. So for some of you out there, some of you have kind of confessed to me that you've been writing for a long time, maybe since you were even really young. And so, short stories or poetry maybe has come really easy to you. And this being maybe one of your first creative writing classes, you might be thinking to yourself like, oh gosh, I always thought story was easy. And now I'm starting to see that like maybe I didn't quite know how to capture my readers all along. And I have a feeling that that's probably true for most of you if you have been writing stories for a while. Engaging a reader and keeping them away from everything else in their lives. So think about their phones, Netflix, their friends, right? How can you keep them away from that stuff long enough to be invested in your story? And so again, this is where we pull in all of these tools that we've been talking about over these few weeks in order to really engage those readers from the absolute beginning. We also have to trust them a little bit, that they're going to pick up on certain clues, they're going to pick up on certain description, they're going to pick up on certain key pieces of dialogue that you want them to in a subtle way to unfold some of the message of the story. So last thing I'm going to say about this is that I want you to really think about language, characters, the conflict. This all should be fresh and original. That said, I have a caveat to that. There is a book that I can't think of the name of right now, but it came out years ago. But basically, it sort of boiled down every character that's ever existed. And I think there's I forget, something like 29 different types of characters. And it also boiled down plot too. And I forget the number, but there was only, it was 21 kinds of plots out there. And so there's really not that many variations when it comes to fiction in terms of what kind of characters can we put in what kind of plots. In fact, for many of the films and the books and the stories that we tell, they're just versions of stories that have long been told. What we have to think about as contemporary short story writers is how to make this really interesting and different than what anyone else has seen before. So you want that language to be fresh. You want your character, maybe it's a character that feels familiar to us, but maybe they speak in a really interesting way, or maybe they've had a really interesting life and so they have an interesting perspective on, the world, or maybe they have like a really kooky or weird job or something like that. So you want to try to use those things to come across fresh and original. Again, one thing that I was starting to see with some of the character exercises was the same kind of character was showing up. And so I want to push you towards, getting out of your comfort zone a little bit and maybe writing a different kind of character than you've written before. One way to do this is just to kind of have fun with this. You can make yourself a list of character names. Make a separate list of character ages, unrelated. Make a list of jobs. Make a list of, character flaws, and then just sort of randomly assign things to each other and see if you can write based on something that you come up with from that. So again, I'm just trying to push you a little bit here to be really creative. That's going to be key in having a successful short story. So last bit here is just as we're going into this week and you're going to be writing an exercise on plot, I really want you to understand your character well. And I'm saying character, I know that many of your stories will have multiple characters, but I just mean the main character and the character particularly that I will see in these exercises. So know and understand that character, understand the conflict that they're going to face. Even if that conflict, again, doesn't show up in those first 2 pages, you and I should be able to sit down and you should be able to tell me, hey, Vicki, this is where the story's going. This is what the conflict is. And I should be able immediately to see that in the first 2 pages, you have worked, pushed or written in, maybe even in a nuanced or subtle kind of way, there are clues there that I should pick up on that would suggest this conflict is coming, right? Make sure you're really asking yourself how to get to that conflict the quickest. And I don't mean like how to write the shortest short story. This certainly isn't a flash fiction class. But what I mean is how do you start it as close to the inciting incident as possible, so that we don't have to sort of slog through your character waking up and eating breakfast before we get to the interesting part of their day. One thing I want to stress is that you don't have to know how the story ends before you get there. Sometimes what we have to figure out as writers, is what our characters are going to do. They might surprise us as we're writing them. They might make a decision that we didn't think that they were going to make at the beginning. I've often found when I'm working on a story that I don't always know how it's going to end. I think I have an idea of how it's going to end, and as I'm writing, maybe a better idea pops along, or maybe the story just takes, like I said, a different kind of turn based on what my character has decided that they're going to do. You should know from the beginning what is at stake for your character. So if they are in a life and death situation, then you should know what's at stake for them. Like why is it a terrible thing, if they die? And not just because death is sad, right? But like, again, what is at stake for them? So as you work this week, try to pull in these things from the last few weeks where you're thinking about detail, you're thinking about setting, you're thinking about point of view. You're thinking about all of the drivers that your character has. And this is going to help you hopefully pull in, don't pay attention to that, pull in everything that you need to write a really strong plot for your exercise. Again, I'm only going to see the first 2 pages of that. And I know that's really frustrating to a lot of you. Some of you have reached out to me and kind of complained about that. But part of what I'm asking you to do is to not tell me everything, sort of show me how we're going to get there. I'm a pretty good reader of short fiction, and so again, I definitely should be able to pick up on some nuanced language if you're putting it down there. If you get work or hint at a conflict right from the first sentence, I should be able to pick up on that kind of stuff. So this week, You are going to read about plot in chapter 6 of your book. You're also going to read Tim O'Brien's On the Rainy River and Kevin Brockmeyer's A Fable with Slips of White Paper Spilling from the Pockets. There's also something different about this week. We are going to start to break into our workshop groups, not on the discussion board, but you're going to have your own discussion board where you're just going to sort of say hi to everyone and introduce yourself and maybe start well, not maybe, I want you to talk about your upcoming project. Next week, I'm actually going to have you go ahead and sign up for your workshop date. So some of you, we're actually going to be reading your story within the next couple weeks here. So I don't want you guys to be shy. I want you to sort of say where you are in the process. Some of you I know who I've met with in my office, or I've talked to you on Skype. You're further along in the process. You have a story that's already kind of brewing in your head, and you're probably going to be ready sooner than later. So my strong plea to you is to not wait, to go ahead and be one of the first people to sign up. There's several benefits in that. One is it's great to go first and kind of get it out of the way. Two, you're going to have the longest amount of time to do editing and get that final revision working for you. If you wait to sign up for the workshop until, December, then you're going to have a really short amount of time to do your editing and turn that story around. So again, just think about those kind of things. But this week you're not signing up yet. It's not sort of a fight to the finish. It's really just about introducing yourself to each other. Maybe tell each other what kind of genre you think your story is going to be in. I know some of you are going to try to write something literary, like some of the stories that we're seeing in our textbook. Some of you might be trying to write something, more fantasy or more sci-fi, and that's okay too. Just tell us what kind of genre you're working in. I've randomly assigned you, so there's no sort of mastermind about how I actually assigned the different groups. So again, everything else this week is the same, so make sure you do your quiz, make sure you do your discussion board, you respond to the discussion board to 2 people, and then you're going to upload your plot, exercise number 5 by Saturday. As of next week, I think, we'll see how it goes this week with you guys talking to each other, but I think what I'd like to do is maybe try exercise number 6, posting that on a public forum. So not only would you earn your exercise grade and you would get private feedback from myself, but that you would, your classmates can actually start to comment on your work. And so we get a little bit of practice in talking to each other about our work and sharing that. So, all right, that said, have a great week. If you have any questions, make sure you contact me. I will see you on the discussion board. Bye.